Number one, you can tell she's Jewish because it's a kinsman. Number two, she was a disciple very early on, before Paul, so this is before 32. Mm-hmm. And she's from that general region. If she's an early disciple, she's got to be from that area, Palestine. And then she was a prisoner. She was a fellow prisoner. So she had apparently left the world of the palace and become like a missionary, but she also has independent means of, money to travel. So, but that fact that if that's her, that she later became basically a missionary.
Ladies and gentlemen, who wrote more of the New Testament than any other writer? If you said Paul, you would be wrong, because word count-wise, it's actually Luke, who of course wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Luke wrote 25% of the New Testament by word count. Paul wrote about 23.5% of the New Testament by word count. Of course, Paul wrote 13 books. Luke wrote 2. Both of Luke's books are written to a mysterious figure known as Theophilus. Who is this Theophilus? And who are Luke's key eyewitnesses? Because Luke said he was not an eyewitness, but he checked with eyewitnesses. Well, we're about to have what I think is going to be a very fascinating conversation. And we're going to talk about who might have been Luke's key eyewitness. This eyewitness we think has been found archaeologically, and this eyewitness is not a man, it is a woman, a real biological woman, ladies and gentlemen, not a fake woman, a real biological woman. And the person who's going to enlighten us about this is Shane Rosenthal, who has just written a brand new book, which is about to come out. It's called Luke's Key Witness. He is the host of the Humble Skeptic website and podcast. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen, the great Shane Rosenthal. Shane, all the way from the great city of St. Louis. Shane, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. I read your little book, and it is fascinating. In fact, I checked with a friend of mine who's a New Testament scholar, and he was fascinated by it. He hadn't heard about this theory that we're about to talk about today. But before we get into that, you were brought up Jewish. As a young man, you said, I'm an atheist, but then you didn't have enough faith to be an atheist. What happened?
I was an atheist by the third grade. And I think that's a good lesson for a lot of us. I didn't vocalize my atheism. I just thought the stuff that they were teaching me was bunk, and I believed the stories were made up. But I kept going through the motions in my, religious upbringing. Was preparing for, studying Hebrew, going to Hebrew school, and preparing for my bar mitzvah. But yeah, I thought it was all silly nonsense. And I ran across some fascinating things in my first semester in college. The first thing that I bumped into, I can't remember why I was reading the book of Micah, but Micah 5:2, out of Bethlehem shall come the one whose origins are from of old, from everlasting. His name will be great to the ends of the earth. That passage goes on to say. Now, I'd seen the Christmas specials, so that provoked some questions. I discussed this with family members. They say, talk to the rabbis. They, my assessment was they were explaining away the very clear passages. And so I converted to Christianity. That was 40 years ago, this year, actually. And later on, I ended up finding all kinds of messianic passages. Sometimes, I don't know, you may have had this experience. You kind of think there are these key 30 passages in the Old Testament and that point to Jesus. And the older I've gotten, the more I've come to realize that Jesus was right. The entire Old Testament is about him. Sometimes it's not just Jesus foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Sometimes he's there in the Old Testament doing the hinting at what he himself will do.
And we're going to see a little bit later that the famous passage, Luke 24, where Luke or Jesus actually explains to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus that he is the center of the Old Testament, that there's evidence in that very chapter that the key witness that you talk about is highlighted in that chapter. But before we get there, You came to faith through messianic prophecy. Was that the primary way?
Yeah. That was that's what opened the door. And I started talking to rabbis. I didn't like their answers. I read the, Christian books and just kept reading. Went to seminary. I served as a producer of a show some of your listeners may be familiar with. I worked with Michael Horton for many years at the White Horse Inn. So we did theology and apologetics. I did that for about 30 years, hosted that show for a few years. But one of my biggest concerns is that fulfilled prophecy is an underutilized apologetic tool. I think, if you look at Eusebius, you look at Augustine, they are saying this is demonstrably true. Just look at what was written by the Hebrew prophets and see the fulfillment in our age. And I don't think a lot of Christians, as I have gone man on the street, asking people, what about faith? What do you think? Most Christians today think faith is blind, and maybe 1 out of 100 will use an argument like evidence or fulfilled prophecy.
Yeah, we were talking before we started this program that you're actually writing another book, Is Faith Blind?
Yeah.
What did you find among Christians in sort of your man on the street interview that you had done with many so-called Christians? Do Christians generally think faith is blind, or do they think it is trusting in what you have good evidence to believe is true?
Yeah, that's the overwhelming majority roots faith in their own subjective experience, their feelings, their intuitions. Some talk about a gut feeling. It's just feet firmly planted in midair. And if you talk about faith as, here's what the Bible says, for example, you bring in some of the arguments from the Old Testament. God even says, I will, can your blind idols declare something in advance? And then, Isaiah chapter 40 and beyond, he continually speaks things that will happen in advance. Most clearly, what happens in Isaiah 52 and 53, the suffering servant, which looks like a chapter of Matthew before 700 years before the time of Jesus. And so most Christians feel like that faith is, in fact, they define it in almost precisely the way that Richard Dawkins does, that faith itself is believing something without evidence. And they often justify it. They justify it based on a text like Hebrews 11, which says, faith is the substance of things not seen. So I address that in my book, how that passage is misunderstood. And it's just something that we really need to fix in our own house.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That passage in Hebrews, if you really read it completely and you go into chapter 12, you realize that, you don't see God directly, but you see the evidence of God, and you see how God worked through all of the Old Testament saints, and his ultimate piece of evidence in New Testament times is the resurrection. So
that's exactly right.
It doesn't mean that you're believing blindly. There is evidence there, and that's what the whole passage from chapter 11 right through chapter 12 is talking about. So you can't just read one verse. We said it on this program many times before, ladies and gentlemen. There are no verses in the Bible. The chapter and verse divisions were added 500 years ago to help us navigate the text, but you just can't take one verse out of context and get the true meaning. You got to read around it. Now, let me ask you, before we get into the key witness here, Shane, your podcast and your website is called Humble Skeptic. Why did you decide to call it that?
I actually think that skepticism is a good thing. The Bible actually teaches a healthy skepticism. One of my favorite texts is Proverbs 14:15, which says, the simple man believes everything, and the wise man gives thought to his steps. I don't think we're called to be gullible. And there are a lot of things you and I, when we believe in the gospel, we believe in the Bible, that means we're not believing in a lot of other options. And so if somebody comes knocking on your door and promotes a different kind of a church, maybe two guys with white T-shirts, I encourage skepticism. So skepticism, though, I think, like faith, shouldn't be blind. So you can have, on the one hand, blind faith, and the other hand, blind unbelief. And both aren't I don't encourage either one. I encourage a kind of skepticism that looks closely. Basically, it's discernment. I think we need to look carefully at what we believe, and we should have rational grounds for whatever we put our trust in. The word faith in the Bible doesn't mean a leap. It means trusting in that which there is good evidence to believe.
Exactly. And we're going to look at some intriguing evidence that is coming to light recently regarding the Gospel of Luke, and it also pertains to the book of Acts right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. We're on radio stations across the country. Our guest today is Shane Rosenthal. His brand new short little book that you can digest very quickly is called Luke's Key Witness. And you're going to discover who Luke's key witness was right after the break. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after the break. Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek. We're on radio stations around the country. My guest today is Shane Rosenthal. He's got a very interesting, very fascinating new book called Luke's Key Eyewitness, or Key Witness, I should say. We're going to get back to that in just a second. You know, my wife and I now have 4 grandkids. We're blessed to have 4 grandkids. We had 3 sons and now 4 grandsons. Or, well, we have 3 grandsons and 1 granddaughter. And I just got the newest Brave book, Freedom Day, The Asher Way. It's actually written by Dinesh D'Souza and his wife, Debbie. And these books teach character lessons. Not only do they have all these great books, they have a screen time place that you can go called Brave Plus. I wish we had this when our kids were around. You know, you don't want to put your kids in front of a screen, but sometimes if you have good programming, it can actually be very instructive. And they've got all these great shows for kids. One of them is called Iggy and Mr. Kirk. Remember, we had Kirk Cameron on here a couple of months ago to talk about that. There's another called Bible, Brick by Bricks. There's several others. Go to bravebooks.us, click on all products. Bravebooks.us, click on all products. You'll see everything that they provide there. This is a great way to teach your kids biblical values and even the Bible, where you're not going to have any of this woke stuff coming through your TV or in your books. So check it all out at bravebooks.us. All right, here's a new Brave book written by Shane Rosenthal. You've got a pretty radical thesis here, but I think it's very intriguing, Shane. Luke's Key Eyewitness. All right, spill the beans. Who do you think Luke's key witness is?
Well, I argue that, you know, the Gospel of Luke clearly mentions there in the prologue that he is in touch with witnesses who from the beginning, saw Jesus and, they reported certain things. And he is dedicating his book to Theophilus. Well, in 1983, there was a discovery of an ossuary, which is basically a bone box in Jerusalem. This is a first century ossuary. And on this ossuary is written, Yehuhana, daughter of Yehohanan, son of Theophilus the high priest. And that translates to Joanna, son of John, son of Theophilus the high priest. Throughout church history, there have been some people who have argued that Luke is writing to Theophilus the high priest. It's a very rare, it's a small minority of individuals, and you have to go hunting for it. Most of the time, if you ever read a Bible commentary, introduction to the Gospel of Luke, it will say Luke's Theophilus is possibly just someone who loves God. It's his patron. It's a Greek ruler. The key word there is most excellent. It's Luke is writing to most excellent Theophilus, and the people who've done their homework know, like, that's exactly the way that, Festus and Pilate are, they are mentioned with that honorific title. It's like us saying Your Excellency. And it's only used of high officials and rulers, like governors. Well, Theophilus then is a ruler. Well, according to Josephus, Theophilus the high priest reigned from 37 to 41, and he would have been considered high priest until his death. We know that he is dead by about 67. So sometime between 37 and 67, that would be, if Luke is writing to Theophilus the high priest, that would be the range, which is obviously an earlier dating for Luke if compared to a lot of New Testament scholars who put it way in the 80s or something like that. All right, so if Luke is writing to Theophilus the high priest, then he would present witnesses who are relevant to what he knows. Or like one scholar in the 1700s argued that if Theophilus is the subject of Luke's letter, his gospel, then it could be considered almost an affidavit of here's what really happened. Here's what Jesus said, from his close associates, those who were with him for his 3 years. Here's the detailed report. And he's obviously not going to put anything false in there because he could be brought in and further investigated. Like, you said X, Y, and Z, but that's turned out not to be true. So if it's an affidavit of what really happened, then he's presenting all this evidentiary material in an official capacity. Like, here is the report to you, but also publishing it at the same time. Now, the key thing is what you find in chapter 24. And this is where it gets really interesting. In Luke's report about the resurrection, the very first situation you find there is that the women come to the tomb and find it empty. In Luke's account, you find let me back up. There's something that Luke mentions in chapter 8 that is significant that helps us to understand chapter 24.
Yeah, let me read that in Luke chapter 8, because this is very interesting. This is Luke chapter 8 and verse 3. It says, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the household manager or the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others, these women were helping to support them out of their own means. In fact, I should read from verse 1 of chapter 8 just to give you the complete context. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Now, these are specific people named. What is the significance of Joanna?
So what a lot of people, what I certainly thought of when I noticed this, I think it was 10 years ago, I was producing a show for the program I worked for called The White Horse Inn. And we were getting ready to interview someone. He wrote a book on Jesus, and he had a chapter devoted to Joanna. I'm thinking, how could you write a whole chapter about someone I didn't even know existed? So it's one of these small verses you may not even notice. And it says that Joanna is the wife of Chuza, who is the steward. That's the way that it's in most translations, or in the ESV, the household manager. Well, as I studied this word, I looked at this very closely. That word in Greek is epitropos. And this is the word that you find applied to governors, prime ministers, viceroys. So Joseph under Pharaoh, he's given command of everything in Egypt under Pharaoh. He is called an epitropos. Same with Daniel under Nebuchadnezzar. Same with Pilate under Caesar. It's basically the person who administrates. So I think based on, and that's what I work through. I try to list. I have an appendix where I go through. It's basically every use throughout that I could find in Josephus and other writings. And yeah, that's what. So if you think of Joanna as the wife of Chuza, Herod's servant, that changes things. But if it's the wife of his prime minister, she's basically, the high aristocracy. And that's why, and she's one of these, individuals who's supporting Jesus out of her means. So if she's married to this man who is a high, very noble person, a lot of commentators today have argued that, in the person of Joanna, the Jesus movement has gone to the highest echelons of society. All right. Well, when you look at the possible connection to Theophilus with this ossuary, it makes a lot of sense because Theophilus is a high priest. He's also a man of nobility. The high priests were the highest officials in Judea. The high priest was, himself very, very, he was another person who would be, it works to call him most excellent. Mm-hmm. So when you look at chapter 24, Joanna's name is mentioned again. She's one of the key witnesses to the empty tomb. And what a lot of scholars have noticed is that there's a strange structure in that story. As Luke tells the story of the women who visit the tomb, you have what's called a chiasm. So it's an A, B, C, D, C, B, A pattern, the D being the centerpiece. And Joanna is at the center of that chiasm. People have noticed this, but they haven't known what to do with it. Like why is typically, even Craig Blomberg notes that the key idea with a chiasm is you've got to find out what's at the center. Something is being highlighted. Today we'll use a highlighter, we'll put something in bold. And in those days they didn't have highlighters, but they would have, there's a lot of meaning and structure, and a chiastic structure indicates there's something significant about the centerpiece, but we don't really know why Joanna's significant. Well, this connection, if she's the granddaughter of the high priest, she is significant.
This is hard to describe on radio, ladies and gentlemen, and even on a YouTube video like we're on right now without putting an overhead up. But people can see this in your book, Luke's Key Witness, and people can get a introductory chapter to this book for free, can't they?
Yeah, just
so
humbleskeptic.com.
Where do they go for that?
Humbleskeptic.com, and it'll be on the front page.
Okay, humbleskeptic.com. Essentially, what you're seeing here is a highlighting of this witness and a supporter of Jesus. Her name is Joanna. And if you go to Luke chapter 24 and you read from verse 1 all the way through 12.
Right.
The chiasm, or the center of that, is verse 10b, so the second half of verse 10, and the person who this is all centered on is Joanna.
Richard Bauckham points out this chiasm in his book Gospel Women, and he's a Cambridge scholar. John Nolan in his commentary on Luke, big important scholars, and they just don't really know what to do with it. One scholar who has highlighted it is a person who wrote a book on Joanna and Theophilus, introducing the ossuary, and I thought that makes the most sense of anyone who's ever explored this, and I am basically piggybacking on that. I think this is the best explanation for this. I think that when you kind of do the evaluation of all the different pieces of the puzzle, this idea that Joanna is, first of all, if Joanna is the granddaughter of the high priest, she would be a person of nobility. Well, the Joanna married to Cusa is also a person of nobility. They're born around the same time. They're both, you can locate both of them in Jerusalem. And the chiasm has explanatory power. And so that, I think, it's a done deal.
We're going to go in much more depth on this right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, my guest, Shane Rosenthal of humbleskeptic.com, and the brand new book, Luke's Key Witness. Much more. Don't go anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be up in Michigan, Lord willing, this weekend, May 17th and 18th. Men's lunch, May 17th. And I'll be speaking at the morning and evening services on May 18th at Grace Community Church near Grand Rapids, Michigan. All the details are on our website, crossexamined.org. Love to see you there. In fact, on Sunday night, we'll be taking questions. So I hope you can join us if you're listening to this prior to that weekend, May 17th and May 18th. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the event is in Hudsonville, if I got that right. Yeah, that's right, Hudsonville, Michigan. So it's Grace Community Church, 3500 New Holland Street, Hudsonville, Michigan. So a lunch on Saturday and morning services, evening event on Sunday. Let me go back to my guest. Shane Rosenthal has written the brand new book, Luke's Key Eyewitness. Let me try and summarize where we've been so far. Shane, correct me if I get any of this wrong. The book lays out the case that the Theophilus that Luke is writing to was the high priest from 37 to about 41 AD. He is one of Annas' sons. His brother Caiaphas was the high priest who sentenced Jesus to die. Then there was a high priest, another son of Annas that was only a high priest for a few months. And then this guy Theophilus takes over, and Luke is writing to him by this theory to try and explain what happened with Jesus. And his key witness is Theophilus's own granddaughter. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
And her name is Joanna.
And that would make sense. Like, Luke is Paul's traveling assistant. You know that from the book of Acts. Most people in the early church, if they associate Mark's gospel with Peter's gospel and Luke's gospel with Paul. So Paul could have been, we know he was on trial. So in one of Paul's trials, it's possible that he was asked to deliver papers. So we don't know what is Luke's gospel related to that. I don't know. But Theophilus was high priest from 37 on, and as you're evaluating, the structure of that section in Luke 24 with Joanna at the center, people just don't know what to do with it. But if Luke is writing to Theophilus and Joanna is the granddaughter, well, then it makes sense, because you're going to place, first of all, Joanna isn't mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. There is one other place we could talk about that she may possibly be, but why? Why isn't she mentioned anywhere else? It seems like maybe people were being careful. There's another guy named Manaen mentioned in the book of Acts. He was a childhood friend of Herod. He wasn't mentioned anywhere in the Gospels, but he is mentioned there as an elder in the church in the book of Acts. So it could be that there was during a time of Herodian persecution, there was some sensitivity there. Maybe there was a time in which it was okay to talk about Joanna and her story, but to Theophilus himself, that's the one where she is placed in the central position because she's important to him.
Right. Yeah. And if Christians are being persecuted at this time, you don't want your name in any of these documents unless the document is going to your grandfather.
Right.
Then it's okay, right?
Yeah.
Because he's probably not going to kill you. Now, I think I've read, correct me if I'm wrong here, that Theophilus, the high priest, was a Sadducee, which means he did not believe in the resurrection. That's why he was sad, you see, ladies and gentlemen. You'll never forget that. Okay. So if that's the case, Luke is trying to make the case to Theophilus that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And is it possible? This is an often overlooked verse. It's just kind of in passing that Luke mentions this in the book of Acts. In Acts 6:7, Luke says, and many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Now, if Luke was making all this up, there's no way he could get away with that comment. If if high priests and other priests were not becoming Christians, and he were to say they did become Christians, he would have completely discredited himself with those people. They would have said, Luke, you're a liar. It must have been that priests had become obedient to the faith. And it seems plausible that, and probably even probable, that Luke is writing both Luke and Acts to Theophilus, the former high priest, to convince him that Jesus had resurrected from the dead.
This is actually a paradigm shift that's happening right now among New Testament scholars. Your listeners can go to the latest commentary by Luke on the Gospel of Luke by Peter Bolt. It's for the Gospel Coalition. They have now a free commentary. We're going to put that in the show notes, Shane. So if people want to see that commentary, they can Peter go read. Bolt writes an excellent commentary on the Gospel of Luke, and he argues that Luke is writing to Theophilus the high priest. He doesn't mention the ossuary, but he does make a very good case that he was writing to Theophilus.
Now, I did a little research prior to this program. to see if there are any inscriptions from the first century Israel that have Theophilus on it. And the only one that does is this ossuary.
Yep.
And if you're Joanna and your burial box references your grandfather being the high priest, you would do that because he's royalty, essentially. You know, he's the high priest, but so are you. You have an ossuary. I can't remember, Shane, is this ossuary, is it ornate in any way? Is it plain? What does it look like?
It's in the middle. It's kind of like it's not plain, but it's not terribly ornate like the Caiaphas ossuary. Okay,
so or Joanna's body, her bones are being put in this box, if this is the Joanna we're thinking of, and it references her father and her grandfather, who is the high priest. This would also probably help us explain, in a purely naturalistic way, Shane, how Luke knows what's going on in Herod's palace. How does he know that? Right. Complete the circle for us.
Yeah. This is something many scholars and authors have written about. Lydia McGrew, in her book, Hidden in Plain Sight, and others, The Testimony of Truth, she talks about the fact that there seems to be inside information. You know, this is what Herod said to his servant. Well, how does Luke get information about that? Well, it turns out that there were believers in Herod's among his court.
I know that the skeptics try and date Luke late, and the evidence shows Luke is much earlier, because Acts has to have been written by 62 AD.
That's exactly right.
And we cover that, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. If it's written in 62 AD, obviously Luke has to be prior to that.
Right.
What is the current scholarship with regard to that? Maybe they haven't taken this into account, Shane, but is it possible that Luke is writing during the reign of Theophilus the high priest, or is this you think this is after he's already left that office?
I'm open to that possibility. It seems like Luke is later than the earlier Gospels, because he references many have already taken the time to write Gospels. So he also doesn't seem to have been one of those early eyewitnesses himself, but he is leaning on those who have handed this down. That's a sacred passing of, the key, testimonial information. And so I would say the two earliest Gospels are Matthew and Mark, and that the two latest Gospels are Luke and John. I just think all of them are before 70 AD. That's the key idea there. And there's even a reference to Luke's gospel in the writings of Paul. He quotes Leviticus, or a line about muzzling the ox. And then, as the scripture says, so he's referring to a written text, he quotes Luke's gospel. So that's, I think, 64. So Luke by that time had already been received as written scripture.
Yeah, unpack that a little bit for us as well. I remember talking to Dan Wallace about this years ago with regard even to John being prior to 70 AD. We actually put it in, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So it's been around a while, but people are starting to realize that even John is probably written prior to 70 AD. Why do they think that, Shane?
Yeah, there's a paradigm shift there. Craig, let's see, Peter J. Williams, Richard Bauckham, N.T. Wright, James Charlesworth at Princeton. They are all of a sudden moving on the dating of John, partly because of just all the eyewitness details that he gives. He seems to know Jerusalem very well. When you test, the architectural, the geographical, the botanical, the cultural, whatever, he gets it right every single time. And one of the key things they're focusing on right now, you probably talked to Dan Wallace about this because he's been on this since the late 90s, that present tense language in John 5. Yes. There is in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate of the temple, a place with 5 porticos. We found the 5 porticos, and it's by that part of the temple. But it's like me saying there is in New York a place called the Twin Towers. That sounds weird to say is. And it's just as weird to use that language in Greek. And that's what Dan Wallace has pointed out. Well, another guy, George Van Coten, at Cambridge, is writing a book on that, with that being the major thesis, and it's causing a lot of folks to sort of redate the Gospel of John.
Ladies and gentlemen, there would be no pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem after 70 AD because all that was destroyed. So when you read John 5:2, there is a pool called Bethesda. It's just north of the Temple Mount. We've been there several times. He's writing as if he's writing prior to 70 AD.
And the sheep gate of the temple still seems to be there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And there's other reasons to believe it's early. As you mentioned, the eyewitness testimony throughout that Craig Blomberg discovered, I think 58 or 59 eyewitness details. We listed them all, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist as well. So this is early material. So Luke is probably writing his gospel sometime in the 50s AD then to Theophilus.
Well, at least by the 50s. If Paul's going to refer to it as written scripture by 64, it's got to be, sometime, at least at the very latest in the 50s.
But he would have to have written Acts after that because he's saying it's my former work, O excellent Theophilus. And he traces Paul all the way to Rome. And Paul got to Rome probably about 60 AD, given our best dating, correct?
Yeah, about around then.
Okay, so he's writing Acts, we know, by 60 to 62 AD. But Luke would then therefore have to be prior to that. And as you mentioned, if Paul is calling Luke scripture by 64 AD, that had to have been established for, I would think, several years prior to that. We have a lot more with Shane Rosenthal. His website is humbleskeptic.com. His brand new book is called Luke's Key Witness. It's an easy read. You can get a chapter right away by going to humbleskeptic.com. So check that out. We have one more segment. Don't go anywhere. We're back right after the break. See you then. Ladies and gentlemen, we're trying to stay up on the latest insights into the scriptures, and this is one of them. The fact that Joanna might be the key witness for Luke. There's archaeological evidence. We might actually have her bone box and ossuary. The granddaughter of the high priest Theophilus, to whom Luke was probably writing both of his major works. And if you want to hear more of this kind of stuff, you want to come to CIA this summer, the Cross-Examine Instructor Academy, our 18th year of doing it. It'll be in Charlotte, North Carolina. Go to crossexamine.org, click on events. You'll see CIA there. You have to apply. You can present and be critiqued by people like Greg Kokel, myself, Natasha Crane, Elisa Childers, Alan Parr, Richard Howe, many others. Or you can not present and just come and soak up the great insights that some of these people will have for you, and also hang out because we eat a lot together. We talk offline during breaks, that kind of thing. So if you want to really get ingrained in apologetics, you want to come to CIA, the Cross-Examine Instructor Academy, July 31st through August 2nd here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Let me go back to my guest, Shane Rosenthal. Shane, we're talking about Joanna, who could be and probably is one of Luke's key witnesses. How likely is it, though, for anybody else other than maybe the Bible writers to use women as eyewitnesses in that culture? Were women considered reliable eyewitnesses in that culture?
Yeah, well, if you read Josephus and other, rabbinic writings from the period, there is evidence that they were used, but it's very rarely. And Josephus will say why they just weren't trusted. He says something about the giddiness of their sex, so it's offensive to us as we read it. But that's it was a culture that didn't value the testimony of women, which is why it's fascinating that the Gospels do record their visit to the empty tomb, seeing the angels and hearing the report of the resurrection. That is it makes sense, though, in this context, why Joanna is specifically cited, because this is someone that Theophilus would love and trust dearly. So that makes sense that you would present the story this way. He's probably heard the story, through the family, but Luke is putting this in the official, what I would consider like an affidavit. Here's the official report, and your own granddaughter is the one who was there. She's, being central, she's the significant witness here. So,
and she is the wife of the prime minister of Herod.
Yeah.
So
over there in Galilee. And if you think about just that idea, I mean, I was reading in Josephus this story of someone in a similar situation, the wife of an epitropos in a neighboring region. Mm-hmm. She was traveling across this great plain from Egypt or something with a huge entourage of many carriages and soldiers, and they were attacked by bandits. And I have this story in my book, and it kind of gives you a picture of Joanna. She's a person of nobility. And also, if you think about Theophilus, like if you're writing to someone if Luke is writing to somebody else, some other Theophilus, well, if you're in the middle of this situation where everybody knows a most excellent Theophilus, then you're not going to write, to an anonymous Christian calling him most excellent Theophilus, because people will confuse him for the guy who's in charge over there, who's the high priest in Israel. So to me, it's like it's very good evidence. We have extra biblical evidence. We have got the artifact. We've got the chiasm. It just seems like it's a hypothesis worth considering. That's for sure.
What scholars other than you are putting forth this hypothesis, Shane, that Theophilus is to whom I keep saying Paul, Luke, to whom Luke is writing, both Luke and Acts, and that Theophilus is the high priest and Joanna is his granddaughter?
So there are a lot of scholars right now. Since the 90s, there have been a number of scholars who have been arguing that Luke is writing to Theophilus the high priest, and Luke himself may be Jewish. A lot of people think Luke is Gentile. That's a paradigm shift that's happening. So that is, I think I probably have 20 or 30 different people in my appendix showing that, that change of a perspective that's happening in New Testament scholarship right now. But the question about Joanna, it's a pretty narrow thing. I learned this from a scholar named Richard Anderson, who has written some articles and a book. He's like a trial attorney from Pennsylvania. He did some investigative work and put some clues together, small little book. And he did that, I don't know, over a decade ago. And I stumbled upon that, and I think he's onto something. So I want to promote that same view. I think when you put the ossuary in one hand and you look at Luke's gospel in the other, you say, gosh, this makes the best sense.
I think it does. And going back to what we mentioned earlier about women being eyewitnesses, it would be embarrassing in that culture to rely on witnesses, women being the witnesses.
Yeah.
Because the culture didn't accept that. Yet all four gospels say the women were the first witnesses. Not only that, as we read earlier in Luke 8, when it talks about Mary called the Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, not a real credible witness, would you think? Oh, and by the way, this woman has been possessed by demons, and she's one of our star witnesses. This is not an apologetic, in other words. This is not a way you would put forth your case. But if this is written to the high priest, Luke's just telling us and telling Theophilus who these people were, and one of them happened to be his granddaughter.
And as you look at the way the story was told from the very earliest period, this is something that people like Bart Ehrman and secular New Testament scholars, agnostic, atheist, Muslim scholars like Reza Aslan says this. The earliest section, the earliest creed is there in 1 Corinthians 15. It's the death, burial, of resurrection of Jesus. He died, he was buried, he was raised on the third day, seen by witnesses. Guess what? All the witnesses they mention in that early memorized creed were men.
Yep. They leave the
and yet
women
the
out.
Gospels are different. It's like when you tell the bigger story, so when you memorize this, you're going to memorize that which has you're going to remember and memorize the apostolic witness, because it makes sense to do that. But the full story later, as it's unpacked in the Gospels, it's amazing that you actually have that reported about the women.
Yeah, the Gospels are just like newspaper reports, honest newspaper reports, just saying this is what happened. This is what Jesus said and did, and this is what happened to him. It's the epistles that unpack the theology behind it. In fact, I remember N.T. Wright saying something like, if the gospel writer's intention was to get you to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and by trusting in him, you would one day rise from the dead as well, they did a remarkably bad job of communicating that. That wasn't their job. Their job was just to tell you what happened and what Jesus said and did. It's the epistle writers that later unpack this theology for us. So it's really fascinating. Now, there's one other thing that I want you to mention. Again, it's in your book, Luke's Key Witness. Does Joanna possibly appear later and go to Rome? Can you unpack that quickly for us?
Yeah, this is an argument that Richard Bauckham makes in his book, Gospel Women. He has an entire chapter. It's a lengthy chapter. It's like 100 pages, and he's a Cambridge scholar. I mean, meticulous scholar, very, very good research. So he argues that Joanna, and he does research into Cusa. He actually says we have evidence for Cusa in the Nabatean area. It's a Nabatean name, and that there is evidence that he was a member of the nobility. We may even have an inscription that might fit him. He says, but it might not be him. So, but when you actually look at the letter of Romans, Paul writes, this fascinating, doctrinal treatise and epistle. But at the end of the book of Romans, you have all these greetings, and one of the things he says is, send my greetings to my kinsmen, Joanna and Andronicus, and who were in the Lord. They were in Christ before me, and they were fellow prisoners. He doesn't say Joanna, he says Junia, actually. And he makes a very good case for the fact that Junia is the way you would say Joanna in Latin. And
Richard Bauckham makes that case.
Yes, Richard Bauckham makes if you follow his arguments, it's a very persuasive case. So that number one, you can tell she's Jewish because it's a kinsman. Number two, she was a disciple very early on, before Paul. So this is before 32. And she's from that general region. If she's an early disciple, she's got to be from that area, Palestine. And then she was a prisoner. She was a fellow prisoner. So she had apparently left the world of the palace and become like a missionary, but she also has independent means of, money to travel. So, but that fact that if that's her, that she later became basically missionary for the gospel.
Amazing. And friends, as we've talked about in this program before, we also have it in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Luke is an historian of first rank, as Sir William Ramsay said, the great archaeologist. There are 84 details in the book of Acts alone, just from chapter 13 to chapter 28, that have been confirmed to be either eyewitness details or only an eyewitness would know, or somebody that knew an eyewitness. We list them all there. Roman historian Colin Hemmer did all the work on that. We just put that work in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Now we're seeing from his gospel, there are details in here that also appear to be eyewitness details. It's really amazing, Shane. So great work on this. Again, the book is called Luke's Key Witness. Again, where can they get it, and where can they follow you, Shane?
HumbleSkeptic.com is where they can listen to my podcast and get a free chapter from Luke's Key Witness. HumbleSkeptic.com, and that's where you can find all the stuff that I do.
Yeah, it's great work, and it's kind of cutting edge now. In fact, the New Testament scholar I called earlier today hadn't really heard of this yet. So it's coming out, and it takes a while for these kind of theories to get into the psyche of the public, but hopefully this will help. So
yeah, what I found is a lot of times the way the story is told does the thinking for you.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. They let their paradigm do their thinking for them. And we're breaking the paradigm here, and I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, ladies and gentlemen. So thanks for listening. Lord willing, we will see you here next week. Don't forget, Michigan this week. Check out our website, crossexamined.org. See you next time. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.